Imagine arriving at Ellis Island in 1905. The sea stink is still on your clothes from your journey. Your legs are sore from standing in line for hours. You don't speak the languages you hear around you. You're young and you're alone. But you didn't have to pay for this trip. You signed a contract back in Italy. A padrone arranged your passage in exchange for your labor. Is it a deal or a trap? So if you've ever struggled, especially to find an Italian ancestor in U.S. records, I would think maybe the question isn't when they arrived, but maybe who did they become? Today we're investigating a vanishing, maybe an accident, but it's a disappearance that's so quiet and so complete that no one in the family could ever explain it. It started with a name, Giovanni Boscaro, and it ends with no name at all. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And today is a video on your family story. I'm doing kind of a sub-series about your mystery ancestors where maybe there's something about the ancestor that has just never really made sense to you or they disappeared. And I'm not a genealogist, but I do recommend getting one. I'm not a genealogist, but I am a historian, and I love looking at the context and situating our ancestors in history. Ivan from Italy sent me his mystery ancestor. Ivan lives in northern Italy. Hi, Ivan. And this mystery is kind of like an echo that's been bouncing around in his family. He said, quote, "My grandparents always said we had relatives who went to America, but we never heard from them again." He has spent years trying to trace his line with Ellis Island records, ship manifests, digital archives, but the name Boscaro rarely appears. And yet he knows the story is real. But he's not just researching. He said, maybe we could reconnect. Maybe I still have family out there. But every search he's had has ended the same way, with nothing. Unless he's searching for the wrong person. Imagine arriving at Ellis Island in 1905. They promised you a job. They said you'd make money in America. But what they didn't say, you have no say in where you get sent. You have no idea how much you would earn. And really no way to go back home. They controlled you and they had the paperwork to prove it. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many Italian immigrants coming to the U.S. found themselves caught up in what was called the padrone system. Basically, a padrone was a labor broker, someone who helped immigrants find work, but not always out of kindness. You walk up to the immigration counter and you get a strange kind of a gift. There's been a mistake. The officer mishears your name. Giovanni Boscaro becomes John Bosco. Because if the name is wrong, does that void the contract? Could you disappear into the crowd, escape before the padrone even knows you've arrived? But the price, you're not sure if you want to pay it. Everything tied to your name, your family, your history gone. What do you do? I don't know for sure if Giovanni Boscaro took this escape route, but today his descendant, I'm still trying to find out. Unless he's not just searching for the wrong person, he's searching for the name that person stopped using. So to understand a disappearance like this, we have to understand the system, the padrone system. Padroni recruited Italians by the thousands. They advertised in small towns. They knew how desperate people were because of the economy in Italy at the time. And so they offered these contracts that covered passage to the United States. But it locked men into years of hard labor, and many couldn't even read or understand what they were signing. Once they got to America, these workers were packed into overcrowded, often vermin-infested housing. Some lived in camps that were just even hundreds of miles from cities, going as far as like the woods of Maine, Pennsylvania, even the deep south. And they would work for rail companies, logging companies, mining outfits where they could be controlled and exploited out of sight. If you tried to leave, you might be blacklisted, beaten, or left with no money and nowhere to go. They sometimes had to pay fees just to get hired, and a lot of them ended up stuck in debt to these brokers with little control over their own labor. This system didn't go unnoticed. It caused a lot of tension with American workers, especially during strikes, since immigrants under padroni were often brought in as replacements. That made the public and the labor unions angry, especially as more Southern Italians and Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers. It eventually led to laws cracking down on contract labor and efforts to limit immigration from places like southern Italy altogether. The padrone system wasn't illegal, per se. It was accepted, and it was even necessary for some of these companies who had to profit through immigrant labor. But for the workers, it was suffocating. Some tried to flee, and for a few, the easiest way out was taking on a new name. At Ellis Island, a misheard name wasn't always an accident. Sometimes it was a gift. Other times it was the price to be seen as more American. Because names like Boscaro might have been considered hard to pronounce, and easy to judge, it might not have seemed like such a hard decision to let it go. But after Ellis Island, the pressure didn't stop. It just took a different form. In cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Italian immigrants faced discrimination in housing, education, and jobs. WAF, Dago, Guinea. These weren't just slurs, these were signals. You don't belong here. In 1916, Catholic schools in Chicago stopped using Italian textbooks. Speaking Italian at home was considered shameful. Even the children were told, don't bring attention to yourself this way. So people changed their names. Giuseppe became Joe. Romano became Roman. Boscaro became who knows what. Back in Italy, I imagine Ivan is still sitting with his family's old documents, wondering, did our ancestors die in an accident? We never found out. Or maybe they just didn't want to come back. They didn't want to connect back home. And a century later, the answers still aren't clear, but I think maybe that's the point. Because survival for many immigrants of all kinds meant choosing silence. It meant saying, I'll take freedom here, even though it means I can never go back there. So how do you find someone when their name no longer exists? So maybe you've been searching for an ancestor like Ivan, looking for a name that's not showing up anywhere, even though you know that person existed. Or maybe you found someone who you think might be your relative, but the name is off by just enough to cast some doubt. But what if they're the same person? What if your great-grandfather was Giovanni Boscaro, but you grew up thinking you were descended from John Bosco or Joe Baker? Not every mystery when we're researching our family has an answer, and that is extremely frustrating to me. Just extremely frustrating. But I think some mysteries lead us back to why we're searching in the first place. We want to feel connected. We want to understand the price our ancestors paid to survive for us, and to realize that maybe being forgotten wasn't their choice, but it was a strategy. Maybe they didn't want to disappear, they just didn't want to get caught. So if you're staring at a dead end in your family tree, you could ask yourself, am I looking at the wrong year or the wrong name? Maybe a name that was once spoken at Ellis Island and never spoken again. So if you've ever struggled, especially to find an Italian ancestor in U.S. records, I would think maybe the question isn't when they arrived, but maybe who did they become? The names might be different, the record's unclear, but the truth is still out there. It's just concealed, patiently awaiting discovery behind an Americanized name. So if you have any tips for Ivan, let me know in the comments. I'm sure he would love to hear you. And keep an eye out for more of your mystery ancestors. I am so excited. I have hundreds of submissions and I'm working through each and every one of them. If you want to connect off YouTube, do Patreon at patreon.com/NYTN. Otherwise, we'll talk soon. Over the last 2 years, I've been telling the stories that often get ignored. But lately, I've been facing an uphill battle behind the scenes of each video. My videos are getting flagged by YouTube when all I'm doing is sharing real history. If these stories have ever resonated with you or given you a new perspective, grab some Be a Good Ancestor merch and help me keep this channel going. Check out nytonashville.com.